See? I reused the intro. You get it? I've done that intro before. So a very cool thing happened. Why did I make my channel? It was to nerd out about WoW. My IRL friends didn't want to, members of my guild didn't really want to on a regular basis. But the joys of being on the internet is we can do this. And I can find like-minded individuals who do want to talk about some nitty-gritty stuff. And you guys really popped off in the video about the Crucible of Storms and got into some really good discussion about what is better. And we're kind of looking at quality over quantity here. Now, again, I don't want to... This isn't a bash BFA video. I know some of you are very angry at BFA, including myself for many reasons. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're just having fun and we're talking about things. I want to get a discussion going. That's what we want to talk about. So the Crucible of Storms, I levied some criticism against it because I wasn't overly impressed with it. I was excited for the Crucible of Storms raid. This is a raid that is coming after Battle for Dazar'alor, but can be considered to be in the same tier, which is something we've seen before. And it's a return for Blizzard to use smaller scale raids in the same tier. Now, I've been really sad that Blizzard stopped doing this because I think that having multiple raids within the same tier creates a much fuller, much more immersive experience and a much more fun time for the player who is interested in raiding. If I think back, Blizzard did this as standard for many, many years over many expansions. Starting in vanilla, we had Molten Core alongside Onyxia. These were different things that we got to do, and we could also go back and do them on a regular basis with alts and things like that. We had all this content to do that was relevant at the time, and then they released Zul'Gurub to go alongside that while we were doing Blackwing Lair or Molten Core, whatever it was doing, and then of course AQ40, which came with AQ20, which also added the fact that we got to use different raid sizes. Now, different raid sizes work in a number of different ways. Something I think Blizzard is definitely guilty of is looking at the feedback of players and saying, what did people really love about X and Y? And instead of saying they really liked this aspect of X, but they also really enjoyed these various different aspects of X. And what they do is they say, okay, they really, really liked this one aspect. We're going to focus on that. And what they do is they leave behind all the other reasons people like them. If we look at something like Zul'Gurub, why was Zul'Gurub so popular? And a more appropriate example here might be Karazhan, but let's stick with Zul'Gurub for now. Why did people love Zul'Gurub? What was the reasons? Well, for one, and a big reason, was people who couldn't get 40 people together could now raid and get reasonable gear. It wasn't amazing. Some people seem to think that Zul'Gurub gear was fantastic. It really wasn't that great, but it was decent enough. But they could get 20 together. That's 50% of the people needed in order to create a raid, and that made people really happy. That's true. Totally true. And as we saw, Blizzard took that information and they ran with it by making smaller raid sizes going forward. Now, so that's what they took away from that. Is like people like smaller raids, like a very simple, clear, defined reason. People like smaller raids. They're easier to put together. Blah blah blah. A lot of very obvious things, I would say. But at the same time, there's lots of other reasons people really enjoyed Zul'Gurub. Let's list a few. If you were running a 40-man raiding guild as standard, you also got this extra piece of content that didn't require your entire raid that you can organize at simpler times. Because if your roster is 50 strong, then it's not that hard to gather 20 people to go and do another piece of content. That's why people really liked Zul'Gurub, even though they were in a raid guild. Those people enjoyed it too, but they also enjoyed their 40-man raiding. Moving everything to a smaller raid size was bound to upset some of those people because they liked Zul'Gurub and the smaller raid size for different reasons than just forming a raid. Similarly, alt raiding is a very important thing, and with things like Zul'Gurub, you can take alts and some mains. That's what happened in my guild all the time. You could take buyers, you could take pugs, you could take friends along with you, mix it in with main characters and all this. What I'm saying is there's a lot of nuance to why people like things instead of it being a one defining factor, and that's the only reason, and that's the only thing we should focus on, which is kind of what Blizzard's done a number of times. Coming back to the smaller raid size then, it was kind of normal and appropriate, certainly after what happened in vanilla with their release schedule, that Blizzard did multiple raids within the same tier. And I loved this because it created this fuller, better experience. What you had is, if you think about the Burning Crusade, tier 4 started with Karazhan, Magtheridon, and Gruul. So we had 3 raid zones per week, which were in very stark contrast to each other, which I think creates a much better experience, as you're not in the same dungeon over and over again. And that's it. And you're locked in there, and there's no variety, there's no spice. There's no way you can compare Magtheridon to Gruul's Lair, or compare Gruul's Lair to Karazhan, and say they're the same thing. And they continued this theme for the remainder of the expansion. In Tier 5, once you'd finished with those 3, you had Serpent Shrine Cavern alongside Tempest Keep. Nobody can look at Tempest Keep and then look at Serpent Shrine Cavern and say they're the same thing. By design, they're kind of similar. They're large, sprawling raids. They're bigger than your smaller raid that we're talking about here today, but they're totally different from each other and create a nice variety. They continued that into Tier 6 with the less successful Mount Hyjal, I think we can all agree, but Mount Hyjal went alongside the Black Temple. So you had, again, 2 places, a little bit of variety, and it's unfortunate that sometimes we just get a bad raid. That happens. There's nothing we can really do about that. If Blizzard's going to try a lot of things, sometimes things are going to work, sometimes things aren't going to work. But at the same time, we still had multiple points, multiple places to go during the same raid tier, which created variety, because people didn't want to just farm Karazhan. People didn't want to just farm Tempest Keep. People didn't want to just farm the Black Temple. That was when it got really boring, is when we got down to, say, Warglaive farming. And you were just in the same dungeon over and over again. You didn't want to do that. What you wanted to do is have this spice. Where are we going would be an often question. Where are we starting this week? And people might say, well, we're starting at Gruul, we're then going to do Magtheridon, and then we're going to do Karazhan. And this brings us back to the raid size thing I mentioned earlier, because the great thing about that, and one of the reasons I really loved the start of TBC so much, wasn't just the achievement process, but I got to raid with the entire guild 2 times, by going to Gruul's Lair, by going to Magtheridon, and then you could break the groups into little groups where you had more of a community feel, which is something people really like. So you got 2 aspects. People loved Karazhan because it only needed the 10 people to get it started, but also there are other people who liked it because it created a more community feel within inside their own guild, of dividing up, having races with each other. All these things made this a really good, cohesive, fun experience for a lot of people. So they continued this theme. Wrath of the Lich King, we had Malagos, a single boss encounter totally designed around that boss. And this is something worth mentioning here because it is relevant to what we're talking about in terms of the new raid of the Crucible of Storms. If Blizzard has a single raid boss encounter, and that's all this place is designed to be, they can have a lot of fun with it because they don't really need it to progress in any way beyond the single boss encounter. That means they can design the entire environment to suit that boss encounter, which gives them so much more freedom to have fun with it. And you can look inside Malagos' arena and go, I get that. Like, this is entirely designed around this one boss, and it's so much better for it. The same with the Obsidian Sanctum. Obsidian Sanctum went hand in hand with Malagos, had a number of ways to do, and was entirely designed. The rivers of lava that flow around that are purely designed just for that boss. And they need not do no more to that place than just create this one cave that is designed for this boss encounter. And that went alongside, of course, the less successful Naxxramas, which was less successful for a number of reasons. Not that Naxxramas in and of itself is a bad raid, but you understand what I'm saying here, is that we had the multiple tiers going forward. And they tried to continue that because we did follow up with Ulduar. Now, it's kind of hard to compare these two because one of the biggest crimes the Colosseum committed was following on from Ulduar, which is where they hit kind of perfection. And it's hard to follow up perfection. Ask anybody who's ever been on a stage, it's hard to follow up on somebody who's just absolutely crushed it. Now, I like the Colosseum, and I will defend the Colosseum because it gave me variety and spice on a week-by-week basis. It was a totally different environment to Ulduar. It was a totally different playout. There was no trash. It was really interesting and fun, and it was done relatively quickly and broke up the monotony of being in Ulduar all the time. Now, Ulduar is a great, wonderful place to be. As I said, some consider it near perfection. But if I was doing it every week on its own forever, like we were for Valinir, in order to get the healers that legendary item, then it would certainly wane on me. Even wonderful food, if it's the best food I've ever tasted, if I have it every day, I'm going to get bored of it. By adding in something like Trial of the Colosseum at the same time, that really broke it up and made you appreciate back to Ulduar, and I also appreciated the Colosseum for what it offered. And then moving forward, they did the same in Kata with the Bastion of Twilight. We had the Blackrock Mountain raid simultaneously, same tier, same again. And then as we get towards Mists of Pandaria, they started to change this. They started to stagger it. Now, we did start with the Mogashan Vaults, and we also had Heart of Fear, and we also had the raid with Sulon, Terrace on the Springs, I want to call it. If I forget the name, I apologize, but you know the place. Well, they started to stagger it out, started to draw it out a little bit. We're going to delay it. We're going to start messing around with it. And then when we got to Walls of Draenor, they really sort of like drifted away from the small scale raid idea. And also having multiple raids per tier. And some of you are going to go, actually, Mike, yeah, it was a big controversy at the time, for those of you who were there, is that Blackrock Foundry was considered by Blizzard to be the same tier as Highmaul. And that did not pay off well at all. In fact, they had to retroactively go back and buff all the gear from Blackrock Foundry because people just found it nonsense. It like didn't make sense after being in Highmaul for so long to have something that was basically the same, but in a brand new raid. It was like, this isn't really enticing enough. It doesn't seem worthwhile. And they had to go back and alter Blackrock Foundry's gear. So in reality, it played out as a separate tier, although technically under the actually Fedora wearers, it's considered to be the same tier. It was kind of the most monotonous argument ever because you were looking at something and going, well, these are apples and oranges, and actually Blizzard said they're both apples. It's like, well, yeah, but they're not. They're clearly not. It was just a ludicrous situation to be in. And we didn't really get any small-scale raids, and it really drifted off. And then, of course, we got to Legion, and they completely abandoned the idea this time. And one of the reasons they gave is that it's a lot of work, and this is important. It's a lot of work to create for just a single raid encounter. We have to create a whole new environment. We have to do this and this. Almost like a bit of like a woe is me. But then I look at Malagos, and I look at the Obsidian Sanctum, and I look even at Onyxia, and I'm like, it's worth it. It's totally worth it because it makes the whole experience better. It's not about looking at this singular piece of the cake and saying, well, you know, it's a lot of work to make that single piece of cake, but without it, there's a missing piece. You can't just do it because it's just a lesser experience. I don't want to go to a birthday party with a big piece of the cake missing. I want the whole piece, even if it's a small piece. We want to see the whole thing there because it's just a better, fuller experience. Yes, I'm fat and I know there's cake jokes in there. I get it. Thanks, guys. But my point is this. I understand it's a lot of work, and so maybe Blizzard has found a way around that using the BFA model. So the comment section from yesterday was full of people not raging at each other, but actually pointing out a number of things that even I didn't really take into account. The bigger picture is that BFA reuses as much content as humanly possible. And I don't really have a problem with that because, as I said, it's about getting the most bang for your buck. People and the art team at Blizzard is fantastic. We do know that better things are coming as well. We have seen Nazjatar. We have seen the Mechanome Palaces. We know this stuff is coming, which is all brand new and fantastic and shiny. That's fine. But at the same time, what we have here is Blizzard reusing a lot of content. And if you think about it, you see it everywhere, and maybe you don't really appreciate how much it has been done in BFA in comparison to any other expansion ever. And what it does is it does lessen the experience. Gotta say, it does lessen the experience. If you think about Tol Dagor, from what I can gather, is used 6 different times. Not only is it a dungeon, but it's also used in the war campaign and the leveling experience of both the Horde and the Alliance in some form or another. Now, it makes sense. Tol Dagor is a prison. What a useful piece of content to have. A prison can be used in a whole variety of ways. It makes sense. But it does mean that when you go back to Tol Dagor, that you've already been there several times. Right? And if you've done a lot of Mythic Plus, you've been there a whole bunch of times, and being in that environment isn't that exciting anymore. That's something to bear in mind. I know the first time on the Alpha, when I visited Tol Dagor, I was in awe. I was like, whoa, this is a proper prison. It looks evil. It looks dark. It almost looks like a Victorian thing. It looks very, very cool. And then you think about Atal Dazar. It's an outdoor area. It's also a dungeon. It's also a story area for the Horde campaign. That's all something you visited that multiple times as well. You think about the Warfronts. They're reused areas of the game where they've stuck different enemies and scripts in there. It's one of the complaints I have about Warfronts is like they're not that interesting. It just looks like you dumped a bunch of mobs in there and made sure the story timers tick up. And that takes away from it because I'm not excited about being in the Darkshore. I'm not excited about being in Arathi. I've been there so many times that it's just not that interesting to be in those environments, graphically updated or not. It's a lesser experience than being somewhere new and interesting, and I think that's unquestionable, even if you enjoy that content, that you have been there several times. And now you think about it, it's like, okay, yeah, they reuse a great number of the areas multiple times in BFA. So we come back to this. Malagos, and we come back to the Obsidian Sanctum, we come back to even Halion, which was something that was kind of mustered together last minute from what we could gather. Is Halion was kind of rushed because the next expansion was going to be a year away. Not that that would ever happen again, am I right? But yeah, these individual areas that are designed for this purpose, do we prefer it is the ultimate question. Do we prefer them to say, okay, I understand why you're doing this. Obviously, you can produce content at a much quicker rate if you say something like, we have a cool idea for a boss, so let's use the Crucible of Storms. And we know that the Crucible of Storms will alter in some way for the second boss. I'm aware of that. That's not what we're talking about today. What we are talking about is them saying, we have a cool idea for a raid boss. It's a troll-themed boss. We could use King's Rest for this. We could use the King's Rest area. Certainly, if you think about the area where you fight the third boss with the totems, is you could have something raid style inside that environment as a singular one-off encounter. You could fit that in there, because previously some people would have said you couldn't use the Shrine of the Storms area for a raid boss, but here we are. So they could create that much quicker, because all they have to do is create the boss, and all the environment stuff is already done. They can copy-paste that. And that provides us with more raid content. And that's what it does. Is it as of higher quality as the other places I've mentioned? Obviously not, because you're still going into an environment that you've already seen before. You kind of know it. It's not that exciting to be there, but maybe the boss is good, because we can't discount the fact that the Crucible of Storms boss might just not be that great, in my opinion. Some of you thought it looked very cool. And then we end up with this quality versus quantity. So are we... Because I'm happy that we're getting these smaller raid backs. I think I've made that clear as how much I enjoy having multiple places to visit on a week-by-week basis. I love that. I think it gives the variety. It's a shame if it doesn't play out very well, but that's a different issue entirely. Are we happy as players for Blizzard to say, look, we could create a lot more content for you guys, but there's the sacrifices, of course, is on the quality. That's where it's got to come from. But we can create a lot more content for you to do, a lot more variety to do if we go down this road. Or we can do less, but it might be better. And I say might, because that's the ultimate question, right? It might be better, or we might scuff it, and it might just not be very good. We might end up with another Cataclysm, Dragon Soul situation where this looks really good. Flying on the back of this of Deathwing is really, really cool, but actually it turns out to be pretty shit. And that's always the risk you take here. So putting in all that extra time and effort into creating really cool, interesting boss arenas might end up with a completely boring fight regardless, right? And that's always the risk. So do they take the risk with creating just more and hoping for the best? But it definitely will have some lesser quality to it. Or do we risk going for something really high quality, which might end up sucking anyway? And it's a fine line to walk, isn't it? It's a fine line to walk. It's not that easy an answer. In my opinion, I would hope there was a middle ground. And perhaps Crucible of Storms will be the middle ground when it advances into its final phase, and we actually see how that plays out properly inside the raid once we actually get to face it. I'll wait and see on that. But I would love to see your thoughts on this. I was loving that you guys started this discussion and prompted a good talk. Really amazed by that. So well played, team. I'll look forward to reading your comments. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.